Carlos had always considered himself a rational man, logical, steady, the kind of person who didn't let emotions cloud his judgment. It was this mindset that had earned him respect in his career as a successful software engineer and helped him navigate the many challenges of life with a calm, collected demeanor. His life was built on stability, both in his professional world and in his personal one, where his marriage to Marina seemed as solid as any relationship could be after 8 years. They had built a life together that looked perfect from the outside, a beautiful home, regular vacations, dinner parties with friends. But lately, something had shifted. It was subtle at first, so subtle that Carlos almost missed it entirely. The small changes in Marina's behavior were easy to brush off in the beginning. She had always been a busy woman, constantly engaged in her work as a marketing consultant, and it wasn't unusual for her to have long hours or occasional business trips. But now, those work obligations seemed to happen more frequently, often with little notice. She had started coming home late, sometimes with vague excuses about last-minute meetings or impromptu drinks with coworkers. She would laugh it off, assuring Carlos that there was nothing to worry about. "You know how it is," she would say with that easy smile, and that had once melted his heart. "Work is just crazy right now. I'll make it up to you this weekend." Carlos had wanted to believe her. For weeks, he told himself that it was just a busy period for her, that she was under pressure at work, and that things would return to normal soon enough. After all, every couple went through rough patches, right? He wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, to let paranoia get the better of him. But as the weeks turned into months, the cracks in their marriage grew harder to ignore. Marina's absences became more frequent, her excuses thinner, and her attention more divided. Carlos noticed the changes in her demeanor, the way she had started to distance herself from him emotionally, the way her smile no longer seemed to reach her eyes when she looked at him. And there was the phone. That had been the biggest change of all. In the past, Marina had always been casual about her phone, leaving it on the kitchen counter or the living room table when she wasn't using it. But recently, she had become almost attached to it, keeping it with her at all times. It was a small shift, but one that Carlos couldn't ignore. She would turn the screen away when it buzzed with notifications, answering messages with a quick flick of her thumb before locking the phone and slipping it into her purse or pocket. "Who's that?" Carlos had asked one night, as Marina texted someone late into the evening, her face illuminated by the soft glow of her phone screen. She had barely looked up, waving the question away with a light-hearted chuckle. "Just work stuff. You know how it is." That phrase again. You know how it is. Carlos was beginning to hate those words. They felt like a dismissal, a way to brush off his concerns without actually addressing them. And deep down, he knew that something wasn't right. He had known for a while now, but he hadn't wanted to confront it. He hadn't wanted to face the possibility that the woman he had loved, the woman he had built a life with, might be hiding something from him. But the nagging doubt in the back of his mind was growing harder to ignore. One night, after Marina had once again texted that she would be home late due to a work meeting, Carlos found himself sitting alone in their dimly lit living room, staring at his phone. His mind was racing, filled with questions he didn't want to ask but couldn't silence. Where was she? Who was she with? Was it really work? Or was there something else going on? The doubt gnawed at him, twisting his thoughts into knots. He poured himself a drink, hoping the alcohol might calm his nerves, but it did little to quiet the storm brewing inside him. He glanced at the clock. 9:30 p.m. Marina had texted over an hour ago, and there was still no sign of her. Normally, he would have shrugged it off, but tonight, the silence of the house felt oppressive, as if it were holding a secret just out of reach. Carlos's gaze drifted to his phone again, and before he could stop himself, he was opening the location-sharing app that he and Marina had set up months ago. It had been a casual thing at the time, something practical, a way to keep track of each other in case of emergencies or when one of them was traveling. They rarely used it, and Carlos had never felt the need to check it before. But now, with his suspicions eating away at him, he couldn't resist. His thumb hovered over the app icon for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt a pang of guilt for even considering it. Was he really about to track his own wife? What if he was wrong? What if this was all just in his head? But the doubts were too strong, and his need for answers overpowered his hesitation. He tapped the icon, and the app opened, revealing a map with 2 blue dots, his own location and Marina's. Carlos's stomach tightened as he zoomed in on Marina's dot. She wasn't at her office. In fact, she wasn't anywhere near her office. The blue dot was located across town, in a part of the city they rarely visited. It was a residential neighborhood, far from the business district where she worked. Carlos stared at the screen, his mind racing. What was she doing there? Who was she with? His pulse quickened as he tried to make sense of it. There had to be a reasonable explanation, right? Maybe she had stopped to visit a friend, or had a last-minute meeting in a different location. But deep down, he knew the truth. Marina wasn't where she said she would be. She was lying to him. Carlos sat there for a long moment, gripping his phone tightly, his thoughts spinning out of control. The reality of the situation began to sink in, and with it came a flood of emotions: anger, hurt, betrayal. He felt like the ground had shifted beneath him, like the life he thought he knew was unraveling before his eyes. But along with the pain came something else, a cold, calculated clarity. Carlos wasn't the type to react impulsively. He had always prided himself on keeping his emotions in check, on thinking things through before making decisions. And now, as he sat there, staring at the map on his phone, he realized that he needed to know the truth. He wasn't going to confront Marina just yet. He wasn't going to accuse her without proof. No, he needed to see it for himself. The drive across town felt like it took forever. The city lights blurred past as Carlos gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white with tension. His mind raced, filled with a million thoughts, each one more painful than the last. What if he was wrong? What if Marina was exactly where she said she would be, and he was making a fool of himself by chasing shadows? But the doubt gnawed at him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As he turned down the narrow street where Marina's location had been marked, Carlos slowed the car, scanning the area. It was a quiet residential street, lined with small apartment buildings and parked cars. The kind of place that people went to disappear from the world. His heart pounded in his chest as he spotted Marina's car, parked just a few spots ahead. The sight of it confirmed what he had feared. She wasn't at work. She was here. Carlos parked a few spots away, turning off the engine and sitting in silence for a moment, his breath coming in shallow bursts. His mind raced as he tried to figure out what to do next. He could go inside, confront her, demand answers. But what if she denied it? What if she had some elaborate explanation, ready to cover her tracks? No, he needed more than just a confrontation. He needed proof. He stepped out of the car, the cool night air biting at his skin as he made his way toward the building. The rain had started to fall again, a light drizzle that misted over the street, making everything feel damp and heavy. Carlos kept to the shadows, moving quietly as he approached the side of the building. His pulse raced as he reached the window, his hands trembling as he peered inside. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. Through the half-drawn curtains, Carlos saw Marina sitting on a couch with a man he didn't recognize. They were close. Too close, laughing and talking in a way that was far too intimate for a work meeting. The man's arm was draped casually over the back of the couch, his fingers brushing against Marina's shoulder. She leaned into him, her body language relaxed, her smile easy. Carlos felt his chest tighten, a sickening wave of nausea washing over him as he watched them. His mind screamed at him to look away, to walk away, to do anything but stand there and witness the betrayal unfolding before his eyes. But he couldn't move. He couldn't tear his gaze away from the scene in front of him. Marina was cheating on him, and it wasn't just a one-time thing. The way they interacted, the way they laughed together, it was clear that this wasn't new. It had been going on for a while. For a moment, Carlos felt like he was drowning in a sea of emotions: anger, hurt, disbelief. How had it come to this? How had the woman he loved, the woman he had trusted for so many years, done this to him? But as the initial shock began to fade, something else took its place. A cold, calculating resolve. Carlos had known, deep down, that something was wrong for weeks, maybe even months. And in the back of his mind, he had been preparing for this moment. He had been gathering information quietly, without Marina ever realizing. He had been setting the stage for what would come next. She thought she had fooled him. She thought he was oblivious, too trusting to ever suspect her, but she had underestimated him. Carlos didn't need to confront her tonight. He didn't need to storm inside and demand answers. That wasn't his style. No, he had something far better planned. As he turned away from the window, the rain falling steadily around him, Carlos felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. He had the upper hand now, and Marina had no idea what was coming. The perfect revenge was already in motion. Carlos didn't go home right away after seeing Marina with the stranger. The sight of them together, so comfortable, so casual in their intimacy, was a scene that would replay in his mind for hours to come. But he needed time to process. He needed to calm the storm that was now raging inside of him. Instead of driving home, he drove around the city aimlessly, the rhythmic sound of rain against the windshield matching the chaotic rhythm of his thoughts. He couldn't shake the image of Marina leaning into the stranger, her smile warm and genuine, a smile she hadn't given him in months. It wasn't just the betrayal of her body, it was the betrayal of her heart. That was the part that cut the deepest. Carlos stopped at a red light, staring blankly out at the empty streets. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. He could feel the anger rising again, threatening to spill over, but he forced it down. He wouldn't let her control him like that. He had to stay calm, had to stay focused. As the light turned green, Carlos made a decision. He wasn't going to sit around and let this consume him. Marina thought she could get away with this, that she could live a double life without him ever knowing. But she had no idea what was coming. She had no idea that her carefully constructed lies were about to come crashing down. By the time Carlos got home, it was well past midnight. The house was dark and quiet, just as he had left it. He stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him, and stood there for a moment, listening to the silence. It felt different now. This was the home they had built together, the place where they had shared so many memories, so many moments of love and laughter. But now it felt like a stranger's house, cold and empty. He walked into the living room and sank down onto the couch, staring at the spot where Marina's laptop usually sat. She would sit there for hours, claiming to be working late, typing away with the same easy smile she always gave him. But now, he wondered how much of that had been a lie. Carlos ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. What was she doing right now? Was she still with him, the stranger? Had she gone back to his apartment after their little rendezvous? The thought made his stomach turn, but he refused to let it break him. He wasn't going to fall apart, not now. Instead, he picked up his phone and opened the message from his private investigator, the one he had hired weeks ago when his suspicions first started to take shape. The investigator had been thorough, sending Carlos updates about Marina's movements, her meetings, and her late-night escapades. It was through him that Carlos had learned the man's name, Andre. Andre was a client of Marina's, someone she had met through her marketing work. At first, it seemed professional, just another business connection. But as the weeks went on, the nature of their relationship became clear. The investigator had provided Carlos with photos, emails, and even phone records. He had all the proof he needed. Carlos scrolled through the messages again, his jaw tightening as he read the details. Marina had been seeing Andre for months, meeting him at his apartment under the guise of client meetings. She had lied to Carlos's face, over and over again, and he had been too blind, too trusting, to see it. But now, he had the evidence, and he wasn't going to confront her with it in a simple argument or a messy fight. That wasn't enough, no. Carlos had been planning something far more elaborate, something that would not only expose Marina's lies, but would leave her life in ruins. He had already set everything in motion. The next morning, Carlos woke up early, his mind still buzzing with the events of the previous night. He had barely slept, the images of Marina and Andre flashing behind his eyes every time he closed them. But he didn't feel tired. He felt sharp, focused. He had a plan to execute. Marina hadn't come home by the time Carlos left for work. It wasn't unusual. Lately, she had taken to staying out until the early hours of the morning, offering flimsy excuses about late meetings or friends needing her support. Carlos had long since stopped questioning it. Now, her absence only made things easier. He went about his day as if everything were normal, attending meetings, sending emails, all the while knowing that this would be the last day Marina lived, under the illusion that she could fool him. His plan was simple, but effective. It would hit her where it hurt the most: her reputation, her carefully cultivated image, and the life she had so neatly organized around her lies. By the time Carlos got home that evening, he had everything ready. The house was still quiet, just as it had been when he left. He glanced at his watch. 6:30 p.m. Marina would be home soon. He could already imagine the scene. She would walk through the door, greeting him with that same casual smile, acting as though nothing had happened, as though she hadn't spent the previous night in another man's arms. But tonight would be different. Tonight, Carlos would be ready. He went into the living room and turned on the television, sitting down on the couch as he waited. His heart raced with anticipation, his mind running through the plan one last time. He had rehearsed it in his head for weeks, every detail carefully thought out. And now the moment was finally here. At exactly 7 p.m., the front door opened, and Marina stepped inside, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. Carlos didn't look up right away. He wanted to see how long she would keep up the act. "Hey, babe," Marina called out, her voice light and cheerful. "Sorry I'm late again. It's been a crazy day at work." Carlos stayed silent for a moment, letting her words hang in the air. Then slowly, he turned to face her. "Work, huh?" he said, his tone calm but edged with something colder. Marina paused, her smile faltering just slightly. "Yeah, we had a client meeting that ran late. You know how it is." Carlos felt the anger rise inside him, but he kept his expression neutral. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. Not yet. "Right," he said quietly, standing up from the couch. "A client meeting." Marina gave a nervous laugh, glancing at her phone, as if she were eager to move past the conversation. "Yeah. Anyway, I'm starving. What's for dinner?" Carlos didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. He held it up, watching as Marina's eyes flicked to it, confusion crossing her face. "What's that?" she asked, her tone still light. But there was a note of unease now. Carlos stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I think you know what this is." Marina stared at the envelope for a long moment, her smile slipping away entirely. Her fingers twitched at her side, and for a brief second, Carlos saw the panic in her eyes. She knew that he had found out, but she wasn't ready for what came next. "Open it," Carlos said, his voice low but firm. Marina hesitated, then slowly reached out and took the envelope from his hand. She opened it, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled out the stack of photos inside. As she flipped through them, her face paled and her breathing grew shallow. The photos were of her and Andre, together in his apartment, at a restaurant, walking hand in hand. Every secret moment she thought she had kept hidden was captured in vivid detail. Marina looked up at Carlos, her eyes wide with shock. "Carlos, I can explain." But Carlos wasn't interested in explanations. He had already heard enough lies. "I don't want to hear it," he said, cutting her off. "I know everything. I've known for weeks." Marina's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She looked down at the photos again, her hands shaking. Carlos took a step closer, his voice calm but icy. "You thought you could get away with this. You thought I wouldn't find out, but I did. And now, it's over." Marina shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "Carlos, please. I made a mistake, but it doesn't have to be over. We can fix this." Carlos let out a bitter laugh. "Fix this? There's nothing to fix, Marina. You destroyed our marriage the moment you decided to betray me." He turned away from her, walking to the door as Marina stood frozen in place, the photos still clutched in her hands. "I've already filed for divorce," Carlos said, his back to her. "My lawyer will be in touch." With that, he walked out of the house, leaving Marina standing alone, her world collapsing around her. Carlos didn't feel the rush of satisfaction he had expected. Instead, he felt something else: relief. The weight of Marina's lies, of the betrayal that had hung over him for so long, was finally gone. And now, it was her turn to face the consequences. Carlos awoke the morning after confronting Marina with a strange sense of clarity. The weight of the past few weeks, the uncertainty, the lies, the suspicions, had finally lifted. But in its place was something colder, more calculated. He was ready to begin the next phase of his plan, one that would strike at the very core of Marina's life. Carlos had always believed in handling things with precision and logic, and this situation was no different. Marina had betrayed him on every level, and now she would face the consequences, not just in their marriage, but in every corner of her carefully crafted life. The quiet of the house, as he prepared for the day, was oddly comforting. It gave him the space he needed to think clearly, to methodically run through the details of his plan. Marina had left early that morning, still reeling from the confrontation the night before, probably looking for solace in the arms of her lover, Andre. The thought no longer sent Carlos into a rage. It only fueled his determination. After a long hot shower and a cup of coffee, Carlos settled into his home office. The early morning sun streamed through the blinds, casting a soft light over his desk. Where his laptop waited, it was time to begin. Step 1. Destroy Marina's professional reputation. Carlos opened his email. The subject line of his carefully crafted message, staring back at him. A matter of trust and integrity. The email had been prepared the night before, but he hadn't sent it yet. He wanted to make sure everything was perfectly timed. Marina's clients were not just business contacts, they were the pillars of her professional world. Over the years, she had built up a network of people who trusted her implicitly, who believed in her abilities as a marketing consultant and strategist. But what they didn't know was the woman behind that professional facade. Carlos had carefully chosen the recipients of the email. They weren't just any clients. They were Marina's most important ones, the ones who generated the most revenue, the ones who had the most influence. Losing them would be more than just a financial hit. It would be a blow to her entire career. He hovered over the send button for a moment, imagining how this would play out. The clients would open their inboxes, see his email, and their shock would be immediate. The polite words, the professional tone, all while exposing the truth behind Marina's double life. It was the kind of scandal that would spread through the business world like wildfire, tarnishing her reputation in ways she couldn't repair. With a deep breath, Carlos clicked send. It was done. He sat back in his chair, staring at the screen as the email disappeared into cyberspace, on its way to shatter the illusion Marina had worked so hard to build. The first step was complete. Step 2. Expose her affair publicly. Carlos had been planning this for weeks, ever since he had first suspected that Marina was seeing someone else. Hiring the private investigator had been his first move, a quiet, almost subconscious preparation for the worst. The investigator had done more than just confirm his suspicions. He had uncovered everything: emails, text messages, and, most damning of all, photos of Marina and Andre together. Their affair wasn't just a one-time mistake. It was a long-term, deliberate betrayal. The photos were painful to look at, but Carlos had studied them carefully. Each one told a story. Marina meeting Andre at a quiet cafe, walking hand in hand through a park, even visiting his apartment late at night. These weren't just snapshots of infidelity. They were proof of her complete disregard for their marriage. Carlos had all the evidence he needed, and now it was time to release it. He picked up his phone and dialed the number of the private investigator. The man answered on the second ring. "Carlos," the investigator said, his voice calm and professional. "What can I do for you?" "I need you to release the files," Carlos replied, his voice steady. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Are you sure, once it's out there, you can't take it back?" "I'm sure," Carlos said firmly. "Make it public. I want everyone to see what she's been up to." The investigator didn't ask any more questions. He simply said, "Understood. I'll take care of it." And the line went dead. Carlos placed the phone on his desk and leaned back in his chair, staring out the window as the gravity of his decision sank in. The photos, the emails, the messages, they would all be uploaded to a public server, accessible to anyone who cared to look. He knew the kind of damage this would do. Marina's colleagues, her friends, even her family, none of them would be able to look at her the same way after this. Her affair would be exposed for all to see, and there would be no coming back from it. It wasn't just about humiliating her. It was about making sure that the life she had built on lies and deception came crashing down around her. That afternoon, Carlos received the first of many notifications. His phone buzzed with a message from one of Marina's biggest clients, Robert, who had been with her for years. "Carlos," the message read, "I just received your email. I had no idea what was going on. Thank you for bringing this to my attention. I can't continue working with someone who lacks integrity. I'll be terminating my contract with Marina, effective immediately." Carlos felt a surge of satisfaction as he read the message. It had begun. The carefully constructed world that Marina had spent years building was unraveling. One by one, her clients would cut ties with her, leaving her with nothing. Her reputation would be ruined, and there would be no way for her to recover. Over the next few hours, more messages poured in. Some were short and to the point, expressing shock and disappointment. Others were longer, more personal, from clients who had considered Marina a friend as well as a business partner. Each one ended the same way. They were cutting ties with her, effective immediately. Carlos watched it all unfold with a grim sense of satisfaction. Marina had betrayed him, lied to him, and now she was paying the price. Her career, her reputation, everything she had worked for. It was all crumbling, just as he had planned. But as the hours passed, Carlos felt something else creeping in alongside the satisfaction. a strange sense of emptiness, a hollow feeling that gnawed at the edges of his mind. He had won. He had executed his plan flawlessly, and Marina was facing the consequences of her actions. But as he sat there, reading the messages from her clients, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. By the time Marina came home that evening, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the quiet house. Carlos sat in the living room, his glass of wine untouched on the coffee table. He heard the front door open and close, followed by the soft click of Marina's heels as she walked down the hallway. She stopped at the entrance to the living room, her face pale, her eyes red and swollen from crying. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at Carlos, as if she were trying to figure out what to say. The tension between them was palpable, the silence heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. "Carlos?" Marina began, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to talk." Carlos didn't respond immediately. He took a sip of his wine, watching her over the rim of his glass. She looked defeated, broken, but he wasn't ready to offer her any comfort. Not yet. "What do you want to talk about?" he asked, his tone calm but cold. Marina hesitated, her fingers nervously twisting the strap of her purse. "I got an email from Robert today," she said quietly. "He said you contacted him." Carlos nodded. "I did." Marina's eyes widened in disbelief. "Why? Why would you do that?" Carlos set his glass down on the table and stood up, facing her. "Because you betrayed me, Marina. You lied to me. You thought you could get away with it, that I wouldn't find out. But I did. And now, you're facing the consequences." Tears welled up in Marina's eyes as she stared at him, her voice trembling. "Carlos, please. I made a mistake, but we can fix this. We can go to counseling. We can work through it." "There's nothing to fix," Carlos said, cutting her off. "You destroyed our marriage the moment you decided to have an affair. This isn't something we can work through." Marina shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I'm going to lose everything," she whispered. "My clients, my career, everything I've worked for." Carlos felt a surge of anger rise in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. "That's what happens when you lie, Marina. Actions have consequences." Marina's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, she looked utterly defeated. She stood there, clutching her purse as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. "Is this really the end?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Carlos didn't hesitate. "Yes, it's over." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, final and irreversible. Marina stood there for a long moment, her face pale and drained of any hope. Then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the stairs, her footsteps heavy with the weight of her mistakes. Carlos watched her go, feeling a strange sense of finality wash over him. The plan had been executed perfectly. Marina's affair had been exposed, her career was in ruins, and their marriage was over. He had won. That night, after Marina had retreated to their bedroom in silence, Carlos sat alone in the living room, staring out into the darkness. The house was quiet, the only sound the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. It was the silence of a life that had been torn apart piece by piece. He had gotten his revenge, just as he had planned. But as he sat there, the satisfaction he had expected to feel was elusive. Instead, there was only a hollow emptiness, a lingering sense of loss that he couldn't quite shake. He had destroyed Marina's life, just as she had destroyed his. But in the end, both of them were left with nothing. Carlos stared down at his glass of wine, the liquid swirling gently as he turned the glass in his hand. He had won. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like defeat. The days following Carlos's systematic dismantling of Marina's life were quieter than he had expected. He had imagined that the fallout from his actions would be immediate and chaotic, that Marina's world would implode spectacularly. But instead, it was a slow burn, He watched from a distance as the pieces of her life came undone, one by one. Her clients began to distance themselves, with emails trickling in from people he knew had once admired her, all of them expressing their disappointment and shock at what they had learned. Andre had disappeared too. Carlos wasn't sure whether he had left Marina or if she had severed ties with him once her affair became public, but the man was no longer in the picture. Carlos had expected this as well. People like Andre never stuck around when things got messy. He was an escape from Marina, nothing more. And now that her life was falling apart, Andre had cut his losses. Carlos returned to work, going through the motions of his day-to-day life. He told himself that the silence, the gradual unraveling of Marina's world, was exactly what he had wanted. He had executed his plan perfectly, watching as her professional and personal life crumbled under the weight of her own choices. And yet, there was something unsettling about it all. He had imagined a dramatic collapse, something that would leave him with a sense of victory. But what he felt was far more complex. Marina, for her part, had been quiet. Since that night, when Carlos had confronted her with the divorce papers, she had retreated into herself, rarely speaking unless spoken to. She moved through the house like a ghost, her presence felt but rarely seen. Carlos had wondered why she hadn't left yet, why she was still staying in the house when they both knew it was over, but he didn't ask. He didn't want to know. There was a heaviness in the air between them now, an unspoken understanding that they were both just waiting for the final blow to land. Carlos had served the papers, but Marina hadn't responded. She hadn't contested the divorce, nor had she tried to reach out to him for any sort of resolution. It was as if they were both stuck in limbo, waiting for something to break the silence. The final confrontation came one evening, just as the sun was setting. Carlos had returned home from work, his briefcase in hand, feeling the familiar sense of unease that had settled over the house in the last few weeks. He wasn't surprised when he found Marina sitting at the dining room table, her face pale, her eyes rimmed with red. She looked exhausted, as if the weight of everything had finally caught up with her. She didn't say anything as Carlos walked in. She just sat there, staring down at the table, her hands clasped together tightly. Carlos set down his briefcase, feeling the tension between them like a tangible force. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Finally, Marina broke it, her voice barely a whisper. "I've lost everything." Carlos stood there, watching her, waiting for the anger, the frustration, the fight he had expected. But instead, her voice was hollow, devoid of the fire he had anticipated. "My clients are gone," she continued, her eyes still fixed on the table. "Andre is gone. My career, everything I've built, it's all gone." Carlos didn't respond. He had heard these words before, in one form or another, but hearing them now felt different. There was no satisfaction in it, no sense of victory. "I don't know what to do," Marina said, finally looking up at him. Her eyes were filled with a deep, aching sadness. "I've ruined everything." Carlos felt his chest tighten, but he kept his expression neutral. This was what he had wanted, wasn't it? To see her broken, to watch her realize the full extent of what she had done. But as he stood there, staring at the woman he had once loved, he felt a flicker of something unexpected. Pity. "I tried to fix it," Marina said, her voice cracking. "I thought I could make things right. I thought maybe I could salvage something. But I was wrong. I've lost you. I've lost everything that mattered." Carlos took a deep breath, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, for the final confrontation where Marina would have to face the consequences of her actions. But now that it was here, it didn't feel the way he had imagined. "You didn't just lose me, Marina," he said quietly, his voice steady but filled with a quiet anger. "You threw me away. You threw everything away. You chose to betray me. You made that decision." Marina nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know," she whispered. "I know I did, and I can never undo it." Carlos stared at her, feeling the weight of her words. The silence between them was thick with unresolved pain, with years of trust and love that had been shattered. He had wanted her to suffer for what she had done, and she was suffering now. But it didn't bring him the closure he had hoped for. He had destroyed her, just as she had destroyed him. But in the end, they were both left with nothing. Carlos looked down at Marina, his emotions swirling in a confusing mix of anger, pity, and regret. This was supposed to be the moment where he walked away, leaving her to face the wreckage of her life. He had already started the divorce proceedings, and he had no intention of stopping them. Their marriage was over, but there was something about this moment that made him hesitate. "You made your choices," Carlos said finally, his voice cold and detached. "And now, you have to live with the consequences. This is what happens when you betray the people who love you." Marina nodded, her tears falling silently onto the table. "I know," she whispered. "I know I deserve this. But it doesn't make it any easier." Carlos felt a strange pang of empathy, a sensation he hadn't expected. He had spent weeks hardening his heart against her, preparing for this exact moment. But seeing her like this, broken, remorseful, it made him question whether revenge had been worth it. He stepped back, the distance between them growing. "I'm moving out tomorrow," he said, his voice steady but hollow. "You'll hear from my lawyer about the rest." Marina didn't respond. She just sat there, staring at the table, her tears falling unchecked. Carlos turned and walked out of the room, leaving her behind in the silence. The next few days were a blur for Carlos. He packed up his things, arranging to move out of the house that had once been filled with love and laughter. The process felt mechanical, as if he were going through the motions without really feeling anything. He had expected to feel relief, or even satisfaction, at finally leaving Marina and their broken marriage behind. But instead, he felt a deep, pervasive emptiness. The legal proceedings were swift and clinical. Marina didn't contest the divorce, and within a few weeks, the paperwork was finalized. Carlos signed the documents with a steady hand, watching as the last remnants of their life together were erased with a few strokes of a pen. It was over. The marriage, the revenge, the pain, it was all behind him now. But instead of feeling victorious, Carlos felt like he had lost something far greater than just a relationship. He had lost a part of himself in the process. Months later, Carlos found himself sitting alone in his new apartment, the sounds of the city drifting in through the open window. He had started to rebuild his life, focusing on his work, his friendships, and his own personal growth. But there was still a lingering sense of unfinished business, a question that gnawed at him late at night when the world was quiet. Had it been worth it? Carlos had gotten his revenge. He had exposed Marina's affair, destroyed her career, and watched as her life fell apart. But in the end, the satisfaction he had sought never came. The hollow victory had left him with more questions than answers. Revenge, he realized, wasn't the solution. It hadn't healed the wounds or taken away the pain. It had only deepened the divide between them, leaving both of their lives in ruins. In his quest to make Marina pay for her betrayal, Carlos had lost sight of what really mattered: his own healing, his own ability to move forward. As he sat there, staring out at the city, Carlos understood that the true victory wasn't in watching someone else suffer. It was in letting go of the anger, the hurt, the need for retribution. Only then could he truly begin to heal. Carlos knew it would take time. The scars of the past were deep, and the pain of betrayal didn't simply disappear. But he was ready to move forward, to leave the darkness behind and find a new path. And as he sat there, the city lights twinkling in the distance, Carlos made a promise to himself. He would never let revenge consume him again. He had learned the hard way that the real victory wasn't in destroying someone else's life. It was in rebuilding his own. If you like this story, we encourage you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support is essential for us to continue bringing you exciting stories regularly. Don't miss the next incredible story that's about to appear on your screen. See you soon. Goodbye.